One of the things you might be wondering after completing the active listening toolbox assignment, and one of the questions that always comes up when we talk about the active listening toolbox is, am I really supposed to be using the whole active listening toolbox, alignment, listening, pausing, paraphrasing, and inquiry in every single conversation I have with my mentee? And the answer to that is no. As a mentor, honestly, as a human being, you're never going to have the same conversation with the same person every time you speak to them. And depending on the kind of conversation you're having, you might use one, two, or all of the active listening skills. There are generally 4 types of conversations you will have with a mentee or a colleague that you might be supporting: directive, personal, emotional safe space, and learning focused. We're going to take a minute in this video to look at each individually. In a directive conversation, you are doing just that, providing directions or direct instruction. You might describe standards and/or expectations or provide directions for what's expected. The goal of a directive conversation is to get everyone on the same page about what is expected. For example, if you're working with a special education teacher who is entering information incorrectly into CSTARS, you wouldn't try to coach them. Asking, what are some ways you might enter that information instead, is not an effective strategy if they don't know they're doing it wrong. Instead, you would have a directive conversation. I noticed that you entered X information in the Y section. You should enter X information in the X section and Y information in the Y section. In a personal conversation, you are learning about each other as human beings, not just as teachers. These conversations are more informal and off the cuff, like a conversation you would have at lunch or as you hang out in the hall waiting for students to arrive. Personal conversations are an opportunity to get to know each other and make personal connections. They support relationship and trust building. For example, if you run into your mentee while you're making your coffee in the teacher workroom on a Monday morning, you might ask, hey, how was your weekend? You said you were going apple picking. Did you have fun? The conversation that stems from here is a personal conversation. When you're providing an emotional safe space for someone, you're creating space for the other person to express their feelings. This isn't a time for problem solving. It's a time to listen carefully and acknowledge and validate their feelings so they feel heard. You've probably been on the other side of this before, when all you want is a space to vent and to be told it totally makes sense that you're upset about X. What you don't want is for someone to say, have you thought about trying X? Or maybe if you Y, you'd feel better. For example, if a colleague comes to you to complain vehemently about a new county policy, providing an emotional safe space is a good starting point. You can see where, in a situation like this, you wouldn't want to be directive. Well, the county says X, so you must X. And you wouldn't want to coach, what are some ways the policy might be beneficial? Either of those responses would shut down thinking and possibly have a negative impact on the relationship. Instead, you would listen and might respond, that sounds really frustrating, to validate their feelings and make them feel heard. Finally, learning focused conversations, and you might also hear them called coaching conversations, empower others to draw on their internal resources to think through and solve problems, thereby building their capacity for future problem solving. If the other person is cognitively available, this again is a time for listening carefully and creating an environment where they do most or all of the thinking, and you, as their conversation partner, act as a facilitator or a guide. So one quick note, these conversations don't necessarily live independently from each other. Yes, sometimes you are going to have a directive, personal, or emotional space, or even a learning-focused conversation, and that will be it. But sometimes a directive conversation might morph into an emotional space conversation. Let's say you provide specific directions and your mentee starts to cry because they're so overwhelmed. Now they need acknowledgement and validation. You might also have an emotional space conversation that shifts into a learning-focused conversation. You acknowledge and validate their emotion. That's so frustrating. And your mentee says, it is. I'm just so concerned about the impact on my students. You could try a coaching conversation there, like, well, what are some ways that it might impact your students? To get them moving in the direction of actions they might take. Never feel locked into a conversation type and always take cues from the other person as to what they might need in the moment.